speaking around. We'll try to move rapidly now, but our first speaker is Bill Wilson, who has taught. He's been involved in public readings of Dante. He's worked well. He's been in the religious studies department. He's been in an associate or an assistant dean in College of Arts and Sciences. He's worked with Eccles Scholars. Now he works with the Jefferson Scholars Program. But as I say, throughout this, so he's been teaching and working on Dante, and it's part of the arguments he's developed in these courses that he's going to talk about today when he talks about adding the Paradiso as well as the Inferno for this sort of thing.
Thank you very much, man. I appreciate that. And thanks for all the great papers that we've had yesterday evening and this morning. And of course, thanks to Dick and Mark for putting this show on. We're very grateful to them for that. I have a short talk on the teaching of Dante, which I had done for many years. And I want to start it off this way. I teach the Paradiso, as Wayne mentioned, every year. And before I get started with it, I ask for a show of hands. I say how many people have read Inferno. And, about half the class, about 50 people. Hands will go up. I'm pleased to see it. And I ask how many have read Purgatorio. About 2 hands go up. And those are generally those who make A's in the class. Those 2 are some of the highest scores on the papers that I assign. And I say, the big elephant question, how many have read the Paradiso? And this year I got a hand. I was really pleased. So, my next question is, why not Paradiso? Why don't you want to read about flying through heaven with the love of your life toward God? And in getting ready for this conference, I've come up with a good comeback to this show of hands, and it goes like this, and you all are the first to hear it. If you love Inferno so much, then if you would like to read further in such tales, a story, say, about having flown to the heights of heaven, and upon returning you can't remember a thing that you saw. Or when you pray to Apollo for inspiration to write your way back again, to write verse your way back again to heaven, you pause to remember that a certain Marsyas from Ovid wanted to get on this Apollo's level and got skinned alive for the effrontery of it. You like these kinds of stories. Or that you meet your political hero who died too young to do any good. And when the big event of going to heaven happens, and we meet long-dead family, where we are told not only that we will soon need to depart from the love of our life for the second time, but also that we will need to return to earth, where we will lose everything that we had. If you like these kinds of stories, I've got a book for you. It's called Paradiso. Now, I am concerned that American high school and early college students are not reading the last canticle and are associating Dante solely with the Inferno and to a small extent with Purgatorio, but losing sight of the Paradiso. If students generally know anything about the third canticle, it is assumed to be some esoteric complexity of arcane astronomy and perhaps a pathological infatuation with a certain woman. I teach Paradiso once a year, as I said, and I'm often told that it is simply too hard for undergraduates, which I think is not at all true. It is as difficult for first-time readers as the first two canticles if we read them properly. I have a sneaky suspicion that what is meant is that you can't really play the spot the compasso game with Paradiso as you can with Inferno. And nor are you able to talk on and on about the cruelty of medieval Christianity. Right off the bat, let me say that there's obviously nothing wrong with teaching just one of the canticles, especially just teaching Inferno. Perfectly all right. Each canticle is a unified narrative of a pilgrimage journey and can be read separately as such with coherent beginning, middle, and resolution at the end. What is missing is the ingenious way Dante is able to advance the themes, strategies, and motifs from one complete story to another and from one region to another, as the regions are so totally different from one to the next. For example, in Purgatorio, those purging the sin of envy, Canto 14, have, as we know, their eyes are sewn shut. If we are scouting out the ways the punishment fits, or in this case, the purging, I should say, fits the crime, how the action of the sin is, in this case, the purging of the sin, we can tell our students the slit-eyed, haughty glance of the envious as we see them on the tabloids of the checkout counter, and that they suffer from not being able to bear the beauty of another person. That's envy. But then in Paradiso, we behold the beauty of Beatrice right off the bat because she can stare wide-eyed at the sun. Canto 1. And see that this virtue of beholding a greater beauty than her own is the source of her great beauty. She is so beautiful because she can bear the terrifying beauty that is far greater than she is. The paradox of that haughty tabloid gazing in envy, which is actually ugly and pathetic and painful, is outdone by the greater paradox that one is a creature of supreme beauty because he or she finds a blessing in the greater beauty of another. So when the souls in purgatory then drink from Lethe and forget the desire to sin, as purgatory begins to end, vision is greatly improved, and this much of a purgatory theme artfully concludes. But there is so much more in this other place, with another person, with very different possibilities in this region, but which, in this different region, which nonetheless extends the theme. Beautiful Beatrice, beholding a greater terrifying beauty, and thus is so beautiful. So let's look at something a little bit more masterful on Dante's part. In Inferno 3, when the terrifying shock that things don't last forever, things come to an end, which causes the damned to flee to the eternity of sin. They seek eternity, so shocked that things actually come to an end. They seek the eternity of sin, which we know is the continual stutter step of trying to find final and lasting satisfaction in the things of this world. Then failing, then trying again, then failing, then trying again, on and on and on. The search for eternity, Dante sets up by saying that all, quote, all of their fears turn to desire. Whereas this total satisfaction begins the Paradiso. True total satisfaction begins the Paradiso. Rather, it has already been had. Dante has been there, he says in the first line of Paradiso 1. And he can't remember anything about it because his desire has flown so fast to this eternity, it has outpaced his memory. So So that aspect of human love, which St. Augustine calls amor frui, fruition love, a love that seeks a complete satisfaction, a love that will put, as quote, the troubled heart to rest, as St. Augustine puts it in Confessions, page 1, has found its proper object, not the self, but God. Amor frui, that love for total fruition, flies to God so fast, it outpaces the mind and the memory. So there is an object of total satisfaction, a true eternity which the damned miss as they seek to satisfy amor frui with the things of this world. Hell is not simply a place where a righteous God punishes. It is a place where men and women, as we know, choose self and its addictions over the true object of fruition love. As W.H. Auden said in one of his interviews, all sin is an addiction. Quote, all sin is an addiction, and all addictions have a terminal point in damnation. Flannery O'Connor said that the horror of our time is that we have domesticated despair and learned to live with it. By the way, Dante teaches a really great way to get students ready to read any of the canticles of the comedy, is to read a couple of Flannery O'Connor stories. She was a tremendous student of Dante, tremendous student, and learned a great deal from him. You know, the whole violence of grace and all that. Seeing her the gospel being spread by all kinds of crazy people. You can read in her stories. Anyway, she says that we have domesticated despair and have learned to live with it. So Inferno points to Paradiso. It begs it. The total despair of damnation is true only because the joy of salvation, Dante hopes to show, is true. And as we know, the mortal experience of blessedness, which is Dante's situation in heaven, does not escape the vicissitudes of human life. Paradiso is no esoteric story of escape from suffering. Dante has indeed experienced the bliss of heaven in its fullness, but how is he to tell about it? That he can't remember it, that the memory, that mind outpaces memory, that love outpaces memory as well. So, he has to rely, as he tells us in Canto 1, on shadows, on likenesses, images, verse. Not false fantasies, as he puts it in Purgatorio. Again, because his flight to God has outrun his memory. For inspiration to carry out this new epic, Dante prays to Apollo and recalls the story in Ovid that when Marsyas challenged the god of song and verse to a singing contest, and of course lost, Marsyas was skinned alive. I always tell my students that would be like me challenging Doc Watson to a flat picking contest. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. A few cantos later, so Marsyas is skinned alive. He's unsheathed from his skin, as Dante puts it. A few cantos later, Dante is taught that persecuted Christians should always be prepared for martyrdom. Actually, those who have broken their vows should always prepare for martyrdom, and he specifically recalls the story of the Christian saint Lawrence, who of course was skinned alive. So all of Paradiso then is a reverse of Inferno. It leaves behind the self-punishment of trying to satisfy amor frui by embracing the things of this world, sex, food, fame, and chooses the suffering of renouncing the self's desires. Canto 6 and 7 of Paradiso, in the song of Christ's atonement for sin, Dante then learns, and he's in a very troubled state of mind. He hears the whole doctrine of the atonement. You know, everything that we read in St. Anselm's poor Deus poem of Why the God Man. And he's very troubled by it. He hears the song of Christ's atonement. It's so weird. Why does it have to happen that way? It just doesn't seem well thought out. But anyway, as the reader and Dante, the pilgrim, slowly realize, God too has left the heights of heaven to meet the needs not simply of the ascending saved souls, but of all earthbound men and women. So God too has left heaven to come down, to dwell amongst us, as the Bible says. And then there's the exile. Dante learns of his exile. Dante, the character, Dante the pilgrim, learns of his exile when his ancestor, Texuality, tells him he must return to the real, quote-unquote, dark valley, and not the poet's imaginary inferno, but Italy, where he must leave everything behind. Well, not quite everything, Dante tells us. Not his words. They stay with him, so that he can let them scratch where they itch. Poker possible. Just read some of those lines for those of us who haven't been through this very, very high drama. Dante learns in heaven, you shall leave everything you love most dearly. This is the arrow that the bow of exile shoots first. I'm reading from the Mandelbaum translation. This is the bow of exile. This is the arrow that the bow of exile shoots first. You are to know the bitter taste of others' bread, how salt it is, and how hard a path it is for one who goes descending and descending others' stairs. Lines which always remind me of T.S. Eliot. It just sounds like Eliot. How salt your bread will be, and it doesn't taste like the food of home, and what it's like to go up and down other people's stairs. And what will be most hard for you to bear will be the scheming, senseless company that is to share your fall into this valley. Against you they will be insane, completely ungrateful and profane, and yet soon after, not you, but they will have their brows blood red. And then Dante responds, I see clearly, my father, how time is hurrying toward me in order to deal me such a blow as would be most grievous for him who is not set for it. Thus it is right to arm myself with foresight, that if I lose the place most dear, I may not lose the rest through what my poems say. Down in the world of endless bitterness and on the mountain from whose lovely peak I was drawn toward my lady's eyes, repeating, the cycle of the canticles here. Down in the valley, down in the world of endless bitterness and on the mountain from whose lovely peak I was drawn toward my lady's eyes, and afterwards from light to light in heaven, I learned that which, if I retell it, must for many have a taste too sharp or too harsh. Nevertheless, all falsehood set aside, let all that you have seen be manifest. This is Texuality talking to him again, and let them scratch where they may itch. Dante is thinking of the whole strategy of the comedy here, as he is learning that he will be exiled when he leaves heaven and returns to Italy. And so the commedia moves in a circle, all parts touch. We learn this in Paradiso. A true poet, now one who has had to write his way all the way to heaven, meets in Inferno 1 his old past self, lost in a dark wood, terrified boxed in by sin. The three canticles move in a circle, which we won't know unless we read the Paradiso. Thank you very much.
Our second speaker is Ahmed Al-Rahim, an assistant professor in religious studies department. Really an intellectual historian, I would call him. He's worked on the transmission of Avicenna, which then involves him in all aspects of Muslim literature, biography, a variety of things. And today he's going to discuss Dante's use of Muslim characters, quite famously the Divine Comedy.
I'd like to thank Deborah and others for the invitation to speak. What I'd like to talk about today is the question of Islam and its influence, and sort of going back and looking at Miguel Palacios' thesis about the possible influence of Arabic sources. And I want to contextualize, I think, Palacios' argument. His book is published in 1919. And it is written in although I haven't read the Spanish, I have no Spanish, but I read the English translation, which seems to convey, and I've read some of the reviews, much of the polemical sort of tone that he engaged in trying to, I think, undermine certain arguments about the centrality of Italy and the early Renaissance by bringing Spain into the discussion and saying that Spain really was sort of the conduit and really the place where the foundations for the early Renaissance were laid. While I think there is some truth to that, of course, in the translation of Arabic into Hebrew into Latin, of a recovery of the Greek texts, as is often described, I think his arguments are also based in that time frame. 1919 is the Treaty of Versailles. And in many ways, I think he is making an argument against Italian fascism and nationalism, and I think in a very kind of strident way. So I think he has to be contextualized, and I take his argument to be largely exaggerated. I don't think that he exactly proves his case. That was, I think, to be done later by Enrique Cirelli in his discovery and work on the Libra Scale Macchio Meti. And I think that work, in essence, provided some of the textual evidence for what Dante could have read in writing his comedy. The question of, so that's one aspect, I think, of the historiography of Palacios. I think the other aspect, and his work is quite detailed, and any of you who haven't read it, I would really encourage you to read it. He goes in great detail sketching out all of the different accounts of Muhammad's ascension and nocturnal journey. In great detail, I think really that's where much of its value is. The other question, I think, is the old Orientalist question of sources. The sources, wherever ideas come from in later works, there must have been some classical source, there must have been some Arabic source for what Dante was doing. And, well, I think that's a legitimate endeavor because there are certain sources that have to be unearthed. Sometimes I think it is problematic because there may not be those sources, and the author that you're trying to contextualize may have simply been brilliant and did not need to rely on such sources. So I think it is also this question of plagiarism that Palacios and much of Orientalist history has been really obsessed over. The question then is, to what extent did did Dante rely on Arabic sources, and what was the intellectual context, and what was the influence of Arabic and Islam in the composition of the comedy? Here, I would say that Sorelli's discovery of this work, the Libre Scale Macchiombetti, which is a translation, a Latin translation that's dated somewhere around the middle of the 13th century, second half, of a work by Abu Qasim Abdul Karim ibn Hawzan al-Qurayshi and Nisapuri, who dies in 1072. This is one of the fullest accounts that we have of Muhammad's ascension. And I will sort of describe a bit of the ascension in a minute. This work was translated, and it's possible that I think Dante could have read this. So we have here Palacios' missing link that often he was charged with in that work. That there was a missing link and perhaps a smoking gun or a smoking text. So this work also has a transmission into Spanish as well, and in Old French it's translated in 1264. So we have some textual basis for this. The other, and this is actually why I kind of thought a little bit about the talk, is of Frederick II. Frederick II rules from 1212 to 1250, and he had a court, of course, and he was designated as the Holy Roman Emperor, and he had a court where he was renowned for the scholars that he had invited from all parts of the world, and especially many Arabic scholars. The particular figure that I have in mind here is someone who was dispatched by the Ayyubids to his court, a scholar named Urmawi. Urmawi was an important figure in the reception of Avicenna. And he also, as with many scholars in the medieval Arabic tradition, worked as an emissary for many of the rulers, and he was dispatched to the court of Frederick II. And this is the account of the historical, in a biographical dictionary. It says in 637, 1240, that is the entry date, when Al-Malik al-Adil II was dethroned, and his brother, Al-Malik al-Salih Najmuddin al-Ayyub, came to power Egypt. With a peace treaty in 1229 between his father and Al-Malik al-Kamil and Frederick II enduring, Al-Malik al-Salih sent Al-Allama Sirajuddin al-Urmawi, who was then judge of Rum, that is Anatolia, to Frederick II in Palermo. There, Sirajuddin remained as an honored guest with him for a while. He composed for Frederick II a work on logic. The emperor, as he referred to him, an Imperator, having greatly favored him with gifts, Sirajuddin returned with honor to Al-Malik al-Salih. The importance, I think, of this account, and I think what the argument that I would make if one were to sort of contextualize Dante in his period, is that while Frederick II clearly dies in 1250, Dante was born in 1265, he was very much, I think, taken by Frederick II, and especially, I think, what is described as the Sicilian school of poetry. There, that I think provided a model, as far as I can tell from the secondary literature, for Dante. Frederick II doesn't make it into the Paradiso. He, in fact, makes it into the Inferno, and is there among the heretics. And also, I should add, with Muhammad and Ali disappearing the description of which I think I should read at least if we're going to be talking about Islam. I think it is quite dramatic in the description of Dante in the Inferno. He says, and this is from the Mendelbaum translation, "No barrow, even though it's lost a hoop or ending piece, ever gapes as one whom I saw ripped right from his chin to where we fart. His bowels hung between his legs. One saw his vitals in the miserable sack that makes of what we swallow excrement. While I was all intent on watching him, he looked at me, that is Muhammad, and with his hands he spread his chest and said, 'See how I split myself, and see how maimed Muhammad is, and he who walks and weeps before me is Ali,'" his son-in-law and cousin, for Shia Imam as well, "whose face is opened wide from chin to forelock." That, of course, is kind of the famous sort of thing about Islam and the Inferno. However, Dante had a great deal of regard for other Muslims, and that would be Saladin, most importantly, who's in purgatory, and for Dante, I think, and Professor Cantor has written a nice article on this, and that is Averroes, who dies in 1198. He is sort of credited, at least in some of the histories of Islamic philosophy, as sort of the last gasp after Ghazali, something that I spent my career trying to disprove, that there was philosophy after Ghazali. But the importance, I think, of Averroes, and most importantly Avicenna, my man, who dies in 1037, they are placed among the philosophers in purgatory. So Dante, I think, being very much aware of the intellectual circles, I think, that came out of Frederick II's court, I think placed them well among the philosophers to eternally debate those questions. So I would say then the significance in thinking about Islam and Dante is really to not so much diminish from what Dante did in terms of trying to provide the sources, but simply to contextualize them within a milieu that included Islam and the Arabic sources. That one, I think, cannot understand what Dante was up to unless one takes into account this intellectual exchange that was going on. And it is very well established, and we have all of the translations. And it is, I think, the role of Arabic, and to some extent Islam, in interaction with Europe, so far as it can be defined as that of this period, which I think laid the foundations for both for the early Renaissance. Now, what I'd like to do is just briefly go through some pictures here of the Ascension and the nocturnal journey. For those of you who are not familiar with it, this comes from a very, let's say, indirect, sort of ambiguous verse in the Quran that talks about how God had taken Muhammad from the sacred mosque to the furthest mosque, Masjid al-Aqsa. It's not entirely defined that it's Jerusalem. Perhaps the sacred mosque would be the Kaaba. But in any case, in this journey, he goes through the Inferno, through hell, describes many of the punishments and many of the sins, avarice, gluttony, backbiting, hypocrisy, all of these things in great detail. And then he, on the back of this human-headed stallion, he descends to heaven. And there he meets all of the prophets. And he goes through his journey, and it is there that he negotiates, in certain accounts, the rites and practices of Muslims that are associated with the pillars, including, most importantly, I'll just sort of scroll through these, including, most importantly, the prayers. There's an account, I think I might have an image, of how Muhammad goes up to God and comes down and meets Moses, and he says, God said that my community should perform 1,000 prayers a day. Moses says, they'll never do it, so go back and negotiate a lower one. And it goes back and forth 100, and finally he gets it down to 5. And Moses tells him, you still have to go back and negotiate it lower. Muhammad said, listen, I brought it down to 5, I think we'll stick with that. And so he then descends back to earth, and that is sort of the account of where the number of prayers comes from. And of course he meets all of the angels, as you see here.